Before we start this video, a large thank you to Zach, Alessandro, Fabricio, Courtney, Brock, Joshua, Mathis, Frank, Andrew, Braze, and Bruce for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Okay, hey guys, today we're going to work on our interaction system. So basically, I'm going to drag this box I have here, it's called box of ammo, into the scene. And we're going to really make the functionality for a system that allows us to interact with objects in the world. This could be items, opening doors, pulling levers, etc. So we're just going to use this box as an example. I'm just going to unpack this prefab. You can use whatever you want. Use a cube if you want. I'm just going to show you how this is going to work. We're going to get into specific examples in the later episodes, but for now we're going to lay the foundation down for being able to interact with objects in the environment. So let's make an empty game object here. I'm just going to call this Interactables, or Interactable Objects. I'm just going to place this in the scene, and this is really going to just be the game object that houses all the things in our level that we can interact with. I'm going to reset the transform and drag this box under here like so. Alright, so this is going to represent a box of ammo. Let's add a UI image to it, and that will automatically create a canvas, okay? And this is going to allow us to put some UI elements on it. I'm going to call this image Interactable Image, and I'm going to make the canvas set to world space, not screen space. This will allow the UI to appear in the world over the object. Now, you're going to have to go over here and reset the transform of this, and then kind of double click on it and zoom in. You can see you don't want to scale it down. You want to actually edit the dimensions of it. So as you can see what I'm doing here on screen, take the edges and drag them down until you have it, fairly small. This could take you a second. Just play around with it until you get it the size that you want it. My goal is to make it a perfect square and put it just above the game object here. So if I click on Alt here, I can resize the image to the size of the canvas. So then it shrinks, and then I can just shrink the canvas again some more, like so. And I'm just going to get it to roughly the size of a square and then place it over my object. Because in the Resident Evil series, the remake, when you get close to an interactable object, a button appears over it to indicate you can press it to pick it up. I'm not going to use a button. I'm going to use the little arrow icon instead because it'll be just neutral across all platforms. You can make it a button if you like and change it to your needs. Now, I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, but it doesn't matter because we're going to make a Billboard script to make it always face the camera. So under this interactable image here, I'm going to quickly drag in this arrow I've made into the game. If you guys want it, I can provide it in the description. And I'm going to set it to Sprite 2D and UI. Click Apply. It appears I have made a slight mistake on it, so I'm going to fix that in Photoshop and come right back. You can see there's some edges there in the bottom right corner of it, so I'll be right back. Just going to touch that up. Okay, now that's fixed, and there we go. We have our arrow. Excellent. So we want to disable, or enable this rather, when the player is within range. So for now, let's disable the game object. We want to disable when the player leaves range of interacting with the object. So let's create a new script. This one will be our base class. We're going to call it Interactable Object. And this will be the base class of everything in our game that we make a script for that you may be able to interact with. So what do we need first? Well, we're going to need the player, and we're going to make some notes here first. We're going to say this is the base class for interactable objects. I'll leave some examples: items, doors, levers, etc. And this will basically all share some of the same functionality. Obviously, some objects will be a little bit different, so that's why we derive from the base class and edit as needed. So I'm going to make a protected player manager variable to indicate our player. The reason why I'm using protected is because then we can use it across any class that inherits the variables of this class. So yeah, this is going to be the player that is interacting with the object. We need that for the future to know what's going to happen after we interact. And then I'm going to need the game object that houses the interactable image. We need this because we're going to turn this on and off depending on when the player is within interactable range of this object. You can do this a number of ways, a limitless amount of ways, but I'm going to show you the way I like to do it and a way I enjoy. It's also how I handle it in Nephilim, my project with Rob. So next we're going to need a protected collider variable. This will be the interactable collider. Basically, this is the collision, or the collider that detects when the player is in collision with the box of this object, so then we can interact. So it's like a big invisible circle or a box. When you walk into it, you're able to interact with this object, and then the interactable image will display. So to actually set this up, we need on trigger enter right now and on trigger exit. And if you're not familiar with these functions, basically this function detects when a collider enters our trigger, and it will do some logic whatever we have in here. So we can say optional, check for a specific layer of collider. So if you want to only run this code on a certain layer, we can do that, and we will do that in the next video. But for now, I'll just get down to actually showing you the logic. Running it only on a specific layer is better for memory, so we can make a layer for the player only. First, I'm going to say if player is equal to null, then we need our player variable. So we'll say player equals other, as in the other collider, dot get component player manager. Okay. And then down here, we're going to do the same thing because we need to know that when we exit, if it happens to be null, it shouldn't be if it's already entered. Then we're going to say if player does not equal null, we're going to run some logic. And in this, we want to actually say our interactable image dot set active is equal to true. Because this variable is type GameObject, we don't need to say interactable.GameObject.setActive. We can just say interactable.setActive. And all this does is it turns on the GameObject so we can see the image. Now, when we leave, likewise, we want to set it to false. So you enter the trigger, it turns it on. You leave the trigger, it turns it off. It is very simple. So now if I were to add the interactable object script, in the future this won't be added to anything, this will just be a base class, but I'll show you for demonstration purposes. And then I add a sphere collider. Let's actually make that sphere collider, let's put it out right in front of it, as in like right in front of the table that this is on, and then let's make it a bit bigger. So think of this as the bubble that if your player enters, it will basically prompt you to be able to interact with this object. You can set this up anywhere that you want, and now we actually have to make this serializable and set it to a trigger. That's very important. Otherwise, the code won't run and your player won't be able to enter it. So that's why it's called on trigger enter, because this collider acts as a trigger, not as an actual collision sphere. So let's make a serializable field right here for our protected GameObject interactable image variable. We do this so we can see it in the inspector and actually drag in our collider. Optionally, you can make an awake or start method and say that the collider equals get component collider. But if you want to put the collider on a different game object, you won't be able to do that. So now if I start the game here, we can go over here, and if I enter this sphere, you will see that the image will come on. There we go. But it doesn't rotate to face the camera, so what happens, and if I leave, it goes off. So if you go in here then rotate your camera, you can see it kind of doesn't turn with the camera, and you might like that. I think it looks pretty cool actually, but just for the sake of educational purposes, I'll show you guys how to make it follow the camera. So on the canvas game object, let's add a script called Billboard World UI. And this just means exactly what it says. We're going to make the world UI on this game object Billboard, which means it will always face the camera. Let's add a late update function. And what we want to do is also add a camera variable. We can call this main camera. Now, in this tutorial, there should always only be one camera in your scene. So on awake, we're going to say main camera equals camera.main. The reason we can do this is because the camera we have in the scene actually uses the tag main camera. And I'll show you. If we go to my player camera here, go to the camera object, and you can see the tag is set to main camera. There's only one of these in the scene at a time, so this works perfectly for that. Now under late update, all we have to do is make it face this camera. So we're going to say if main camera does not equal null, then we're going to simply say transform dot look at, and then we're going to say main camera dot transform dot position plus main camera dot transform dot forward. And we save that, and now that should always face the camera. So now if I were to jump back in the game here now and try that out, which I'm going to do in a moment, that should work just fine. So I'm just going to expand the radius of this here so we can kind of walk around it a bit more, and I can kind of go a bit further away from it without it fully disappearing. Okay, so now if I walk up to the interactable collider, you should see the, yes, it's appeared, and now if I turn the camera, as you can see, it faces the camera no matter what way you are rotating. So you might like that better. I think both are pretty cool, honestly, but I'm going to keep this one for the sake of the tutorial. Now, if we go back into the script here, you can see we're actually running a late update. And just to save some memory, I don't want this to run every single frame because it's honestly needless. So what we can do, instead of using this interactable image, we can set that to active, and we're actually going to change the name right now of the canvas. And I'm going to change this to interactable icon. And then on the canvas, I'm just going to call this interactable canvas. This is just so I can keep the naming conventions the same. And then we're going to rename our variable in here that we have right now called interactable image. Let's rename this to interactable canvas, and then instead we'll drag the canvas in. That way we're disabling the canvas, which in turn is not running the late update function unless it's enabled. So basically every time we come in here, we're enabling the canvas, which enables that Billboard script, and we leave, it turns it back off. This just saves a little tiny bit of memory, and it's nice to have practices like this. Just try to save and conserve wherever you can. If you don't need to run an update function, don't do it. Then drag our canvas into this script, and that worked just fine, and then just instead disable the whole canvas. Now if I go into the game here, you can see the late update function is actually not running right now. And if I go in here and walk up to the collider, there it is, boom, it turns on, and now it is running, it's facing the camera, and if I were to leave, it turns off again. So it's just a little bit of memory being saved, which is always nice. Okay, so that is basically how we're going to notify our player that they can pick something up. But we still have to do a few more things. We want them to be able to actually interact with the item itself. Let's open up our inputs here. Going to player actions. I am going to create a new input button. I'm just going to make a button here. I'm going to call it interact. And for the key binding, what should I set it to? Let's put it to A on the keyboard. My brain just goes to an Xbox controller. Okay, save. There we go. And let's actually set that up on the input manager now. So let's go up here, double click. And now right where we have button inputs, let's make a public bool, interact or interaction input, whichever you would prefer. And just real quick on the player, let's make a script called player interaction manager. I'm going to show you what this will do at the end of the video. This will be for the future interactable object videos when we do specific examples. But let's just make that and add it to the player. And then on enable in our input manager, let's add our new button. So I'm going to say player controls.playeractions.interact.performed plus equals I equals greater than interaction input equals true. So I renamed mine to interaction input instead of interact input, but whenever you press the button, it changes the bool to true, the same as any other input. Next, let's make a virtual void on the interactable object script called interact. And this will need the player, so we'll pass some data of type player manager. We'll call that player. And this will be called on every interactable object that derives from this class, and we use a virtual void so we can change it to our liking depending on what interactable object is using it. For example, an item will be different than opening a door, etc. So let's make a debug.log, you have interacted, just know that we've done this successfully. And what we want to do then is make our onTriggerExit and onTriggerEnter virtual voids too, in case you want to change those in the future. And then we're going to add a new one called onTriggerStay. So let's type onTriggerStay. And then we're going to make that a virtual void too in case we want to change it in the future scripts. But all this does is for every frame the collider is in this collider, it runs this logic. So think of it like an update method that only activates if this collider is within the trigger. So we're going to say if player does not equal null, then we're going to say if player.inputManager.interactionInput equals true. And we need to set our input manager to public because we can't reference it right now because I believe it's private. So let's go to the player manager and up here on the input manager, let's make this public. And then we're going to say if the interaction input is true, well, we want to interact. So we'll say if player.inputManager.interactionInput. Then we're going to call upon our interaction function that we've just made down below. So basically we press in my case, it's the A button, which I just now realized is the movement button, which I will have to change. Then we're going to just say interact, and we'll just get this debug message in the console verifying that we've done it. So we'll pass the player, there we go, and now let's save that. Okay, so I'm going to hop over to the player interaction manager. I'm just going to make a couple lines of pseudocode. So let's say, for example, we're going to handle a pickup item interaction. This will be a function for adding the item to our inventory, etc., etc. And then handling the open door interaction in the future will be, it'll just make the player play an animation as the door opens. So I'll just put like a bracket here and say adds item to inventory. And then I can put a bracket here and say plays opening door animation. So you can see how this manager will kind of really handle the functions and how they all might be a little bit different. You can also handle them from the script, but I'll show you. It will all make sense in the future. So now we have this set up. Let's actually go into the game here now, and we can walk up to our object. And if I press the A button, which I've done already, so it's active, you can see we have interacted. Okay, now there's a couple of problems. The function or the bool never resets. And we're going to change that from A to enter because that's our movement input, which we don't want. Now, we can't just do this like a normal button where we have if interaction input equals true, then we set it to false immediately. So I'm going to set this to enter. We can't do this because if we do that in the input manager, then it will never be registered on the interactable script because the second it sets to true, it will be set to false before anything can happen. So what we need to do instead is we need to basically check to see if the player can interact. And this is very easy. On the player manager, we're just going to add a bool. And you can call it whatever you want as long as it's very clear and indicative of we're able to interact with something. So I'm going to say public bool can interact. Very straightforward, okay? And when we enter the interactable object trigger, we want to make it so we can interact, and when we leave, we want to make it so we can't interact. So we're going to say down here on onTriggerExit, player.canInteract is equal to false. And then on the enter, we're going to say player.canInteract is equal to true. Okay? So that updates our flag, and that lets us know that we are eligible to interact with an object. Then on the input manager, we're going to come all the way down to the bottom here. We're going to make a private void called handle interaction input. Handle interaction input. And then we're going to simply say if interaction input, and then we're going to say if player dot can interact is false. So if we can't interact and we've actually pressed our interaction input, we're going to automatically set that to false. Now you'll notice if we can interact, nothing will happen here. So what we're going to do is we're going to reset it from the interactable script itself if we can. I'm going to change that to player instead of player manager just because. So now if we press it and we're not within an interactable object, it automatically resets. Let's call that up here. Let's say handle interaction input. Now if we are within the circle and it does turn on, what we want to do is come in here and say immediately interaction input is equal to false. So player.inputManager.interaction input is equal to false. And then we want to just play the game here, and you'll see it should only run one time. So I'm going to run up to the box of ammo. The icon will appear. I will hit enter, and boom, you have interacted. Now, in a system that's more complete, what would happen is we would delete the box of ammo and add it to our inventory. So we're going to get into specific examples in the future. We're going to do things like doors, levers, and item pickups. But this is the framework and the foundation for every object in the game that we can interact with. So if you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like, leave a comment. It does help appease the YouTube algorithm gods. And don't worry, guys, I will get back to posting this series quite frequently. It's just right now, this whole month especially, I've been quite busy. I expect my schedule to go back to normal around June. A large thank you to my patrons. Honestly, guys, thank you so much. It's because of you guys I get to keep making the videos. I really appreciate your existence. I will see you guys in the next video.